Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined by Kelsey Hazzard, president of Secular Pro-Life. Is that correct?
Hi, everyone. Yes. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. One of the things that I've heard you mention before is that in the media, pro-life is often spun as a purely religious element,
Mhm.
and you seem to argue that there's actually a sort of secular part to the pro-life movement. So I guess to start off, were you always secular and were you always pro-life?
Good questions. I'll start with the second question. I was always pro-life from the time when I was old enough to understand what abortion is and does. Um, I was actually raised in the Methodist Church, and for those who don't know, that is officially a pro-choice denomination. So I grew up never hearing any sermons against abortion or for. I mean, my church growing up was just very neutral about it and didn't speak up on either side. I'm not that person who grew up going to the March for Life or to sidewalk counseling or any of those things. I really didn't get involved in the pro-life movement until college. And so for a time there, I was doing pro-life advocacy, technically in direct opposition to my church, which was not sustainable in the long run. Ultimately, for completely unrelated reasons, I stopped going to church. And because my pro-life advocacy had never been tied to religion, it didn't have any real effect on the work I was doing to end abortion. So that's my story in a nutshell. It's not terribly interesting. I apologize that it's not one of those grand conversion narratives, but here we are.
Well, that's very interesting. Normally, we'd expect it to be the reverse.
Mm.
That's what the stereotype would be otherwise. Now, you mentioned that again, like you said in previous interviews, that there's actually a secular component to the pro-life movement. So why don't you sketch out the history of the North American pro-life movement?
Sure. So I'm actually going to twist your question a little bit, just for my purposes. It's easier to talk about the history of the pro-abortion movement in the United States. For those listeners who don't know, Bernard Nathanson is a name you should definitely look into. He was very active in the abortion movement in the late 60s, early 70s, trying to make abortion legal in the United States. He co-founded NARAL, which at the time stood for National Association for Repeal of Abortion Law, and it's gone through different meanings since then, since Roe v. Wade. But it remains one of the larger, more influential pro-choice groups to this day. He was co-founder of NARAL, and he was himself an abortionist. After Roe v. Wade, he conducted his practice as an abortionist for several years until the advent of improved ultrasound technology in the 80s, which is what ultimately moved him to switch sides, come over to the light, and he had some really interesting insights for the pro-life movement from his time as an abortionist and abortion activist. One of those insights that is of particular interest to me as an atheist is the strategy that the early abortion movement pursued in framing abortion as a religious issue. Right. So when you think about abortion as a religious issue, people, I sometimes ask people in my presentations, why do you think abortion is a religious issue? And the typical response is, well, because religious people are interested in it. Priests are up there, pastors are up there talking about abortion. I said, well, that's fair, but the civil rights movement was led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and yet we don't seem to think of racial equality as a religious issue in the same way that we think of abortion as a religious issue. So there's got to be some distinction there, some historical reason why the issue is framed as it is. And it turns out that, in fact, that is the case. The early abortion movement very deliberately chose to, as a strategy, to make abortion a religious issue, and they had cooperative allies in the media to pursue that goal. It boiled down to making the quote-unquote Catholic hierarchy the bad guys, and framing this as a matter of progress versus ancient religious backwards Catholic people. basically playing on anti-Catholic prejudice that, while it still exists, was certainly more prevalent in the 60s. So you know, they play on the existing prejudice at the time to advance their cause, and to a degree, it certainly worked. And it had the advantage of you know, every time a religious leader got up and spoke out against the injustice of abortion, as they all naturally should do, they were able to just point and say, "Aha! See, you know, those crazy religious people." So. So it really it was a deliberate strategy to frame the issue that way, and that echoes through today.
Okay. Now, at the beginning of when did the first activism begin against the legalization of abortion after Roe versus Wade?
Well, the pro-life movement had its start really before Roe versus Wade, because there was some activism from abortion groups at the state level. There were a few states that legalized abortion prior to Roe v. Wade. So there was already a pro-life movement in existence prior to Roe. I can't, you know, it's hard to pin down a year of when you can say the pro-life movement officially started. I mean, obviously, you could trace it back to the original laws against abortion that Roe v. Wade repealed. But of course, the movement has gone through various transitions over time.
Okay. What was the secular presence in the early pro-life movement?
I'm not entirely sure what you mean by secular presence. So, I mean, early on, if you go back to, you know, the 1800s, early 1900s, Christianity was dominant throughout the United States in a way that it certainly isn't today. You know, atheism was a minority in terms of the general population and in terms of pretty much any cause or activist group out there. There just weren't very many atheists and agnostics, or at least they didn't feel free to speak their minds about that. So I wouldn't say that the early pro-life movement had a lot of atheism at its core, but if you look into just sort of the way that pro-life activists have reasoned about their position and argued about their position, there's been a secular component from the beginning. I mean, we're talking about prenatal development. Who is a human being? Do all human beings merit rights, or are we going to engage in the ableist type of rhetoric that we hear from the other side? All of that is essentially secular. So there's been a secular element, I would say, from day one.
Okay. What motivated you to found Secular Pro-Life, and how has it developed over the years?
It had some pretty humble beginnings. So as I said, I got involved in the pro-life movement as a college student, and I was at the University of Miami in Florida. Go Canes! And the campus, you know, it's not a faith-based college or anything like that. It's fairly secular, or at least a diverse campus, and that's how we operated the pro-life organization there. That we weren't prayer-based or faith-based. We were just the pro-life student group on campus. And so to do that, we needed materials to hand out, to students walking by and that kind of thing. And we found that it was really hard to get good quality pro-life educational materials that we could use in a secular setting, because so many of them, you would have, say, a pamphlet about prenatal development, and it would have all the photographs and all the information and all the citations to whatever textbooks, and it would be really great. And then the back panel would have some Bible verse on it. And you're like, oh man, you ruined the whole thing. So it really got started as just making secular pamphlets, and we put them on the internet, and it blew up. Another motivation initially was, I had gone to March for Life and seen what an incredible gathering that was. I don't think I had ever been among so many people at once. It's a really incredible feeling. But just a lot of crucifixes and images of Mary and things like that I was really not used to at all, because, as I said, I had a mainline Protestant background. And it occurred to me like, and this was before I became an atheist. I was like, man, if any of my atheist friends came to this, they would be so weirded out. There's got to be a better way to go about this, or at least some sort of organization laying out the welcome mat and having our own niche. So it was kind of a combination of those things, the March for Life being an inspiration and the need for secular literature. That was back in 2009. And since then, we have just grown far more than I could have imagined. It was really a build it and they will come kind of scenario where, I get emails all the time from people who are just like, oh, thank you for doing this. The pro-life movement needs this. Thank you for existing. This is awesome. My favorite emails come from the people who say, I thought I was the only pro-life atheist. Like, no, I promise you're not. It's just really blossomed into this great community. We are now over 20,000 people on Facebook, and I use that as a measure because we don't charge membership dues or anything like that. So the best way to measure our support is our social media presence. It's been a wild ride, that's for sure, but I'm really excited about the work that we've done and the work that we're going to continue to do.
Now, given the way the media has been spinning this as primarily a religious issue, once you created the Secular Pro-Life, how many people who were secular, agnostic, and atheist came out and said, we've always thought this way, but it was hard to come out because of the media narrative?
Yeah, that's definitely been a factor. I think having the internet has made our work a lot easier. I don't think that Secular Pro-Life really could have existed in an age before social media, because prior to that, what is your organizing tool? What connects people across the world? Well, that would be church networks. That's you already have a built-in mechanism there. Nobody's going to reinvent the wheel for pro-life organizing. Why would you do that when there are already churches and there's so limited resources that need to be put towards saving babies? So I get why the pro-life movement was largely church-based at that time. But now that we have the internet, we have the possibility of finding that person who doesn't have connections in their hometown or their current town, who are like-minded. They can just go online and find those like-minded people and build those networks without church involvement. So I think that that has really been a critical factor. The timing, the luck of the timing has been crucial to Secular Pro-Life success and to the success, I think, of the pro-life youth movement in general.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is one of the well-known atheists who was pro-life was the late Christopher Hitchens. What, if any, influence did Christopher Hitchens have on your pro-life position?
Not much. I think I was already pro-life before I read any Hitchens, but obviously we do appreciate his willingness to speak out, and we're marking the anniversary of his death. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a good point. It's hard to quantify how much influence any one individual has in bringing people into the secular pro-life point of view. But certainly he's one of the bigger names, no question.
Yeah, now I would imagine from a secular point of view, advocating for a pro-life position would revolve around some sort of portrayal of it as a human rights issue.
Correct.
So how would, if you were trying to convince a secular person to be pro-life, why don't you go through the steps of how you'd start trying to convince them?
The first thing that you have to do when talking to any pro-choice person, whether they're secular or religious, is to figure out the kind of pro-choicer they are. And what I mean by that is, there is a lot of division and fracture in the pro-choice movement that gets kind of papered over in popular thinking and in media coverage. But if you think about it, the person who says, it's not a human being. People who are just biologically illiterate, who think that abortion and masturbation are somehow equivalent. People who are just who have a knowledge deficit, versus say people who know it's a human being, who are uncomfortable with abortion, but think that it's the necessary price to pay, that we'll never have gender equality without it. Those are two very different people with very different reasons for being pro-choice, but they just get this simple label slapped on them. So if you try to use a particular argument with one, or if you try to use the same argument with both of them, you're not going to get very far. You have to know what it is that is motivating the support for abortion before you can really launch into your own piece of the conversation. So start by asking a lot of questions. This is my primary advice. Don't, if we're coming from a position of, all kinds of stereotypes are pinned on the pro-life movement. We know how annoying that is. So as a first step, extend the courtesy of not making assumptions about the pro-choice person in front of you. And if you do that, they're a lot more likely to respond in kind and not pigeonhole you, and that allows you to then have a productive conversation.
Yeah, that's very good advice. Now, when you try to make the case for the rights of the fetus, how would you break that down? How would you begin doing that?
Sure. So once you know why it is that the person is pro-choice, and often it will be in terms of some personhood criterion, right? They'll say, well, it's a human being, but not a person because X, Y, and Z. And then it's just a matter of debunking X, Y, and Z. And the best way, in my experience, to do that is to gently, not in a sarcastic way, but gently expose some of the inconsistencies in the application of that supposed criterion. So, for instance, someone says, you're not a person until you are able to live independently. And only independent living people have human rights, for example. You can then say, okay, here's this independence criterion. Is that something that you are applying across the board for the entire human population, or are you only applying it to unborn children? What are some other examples of people who lack independence? There are many examples. I sometimes talk about conjoined twins. That's the most, perhaps the most analogous example of two people sharing the same physical body. But independence or lack of autonomy also extends to people who, say, require regular dialysis, people who have other disabilities, who require nursing care, care with toileting, care, various day-to-day activities that they cannot function on their own, and they require support from another person. Are those people not people? Are you prepared to say that they don't have the right to life? And the answer is uniformly no. So, well, with the exception of Peter Singer, who is just scary to me. But I think most pro-choice people do come from they're not trying to be mean, right? They don't have it in for babies. And if you just gently show them what their arguments would entail, that they would justify infanticide, that they would, that they have startling implications for people with disabilities. If you raise those issues, they generally, if they're good people, will be concerned and think about things a little bit differently, at which point they will usually try to come up with some other justification for abortion on the spot, and then you get to play this little game of whack-a-mole, and the justifications usually become weaker and weaker as the conversation goes along.
It kind of reminds me the out of sight, out of mind concept, kind of like when you're flying a drone from Kansas and you blow up somebody you don't really register, or when you're in a bomber and you're bombing cities, you don't see the bombs falling. And it's not necessarily the guy manning the drone or flying the bomber is a sociopath per se. He just doesn't see the immediate results. And much the same way abortion is out of sight, out of mind. And many people who are
It's an excellent.
pro-choice, don't actually have themselves had abortion. They just think it should be legal for those that want it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's even more out of sight, out of mind. Does that resonate with you as part of the
That
motivation?
absolutely resonates with me. I think that applies, as you said, to a lot of moral issues. That it's and and especially abortion, because not only is it out of sight, out of mind, but the debate has gone on for so long and become so contentious and been, forgive me for saying, talked to death, that people want it to stay out of sight, out of mind. People just don't want to get into it. They know they're worried of hurting somebody's feelings by even talking, religion and politics.
Yeah.
So the concerns you just said, I think, are even more amplified in this context, um, for having a productive conversation about abortion.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is, what were your thoughts on the Kermit Gosnell debacle that came out a few years ago?
Yeah. Um, well, my thoughts initially, of course, were horror, as I think every reasonable person reacted. I actually, at the time of the Gosnell trial, I was just out of law school, and I was doing my first year legal fellowship with Americans United for Life, which is a prominent pro-life legal group based in Washington, D.C. And as part of that internship, I had the opportunity to go to Philadelphia and hear the closing arguments of the Gosnell trial, which was quite an experience. I was in the room with the guy. I could see him. He couldn't see me. I was sitting behind in the gallery. Um, it was creepy for sure. It was one thing that I particularly stands out in my mind about the closing arguments was, again, as I said, people try to come up with rationalizations on the fly. I didn't expect that from a fellow lawyer, but that is in fact what happened, because this defense attorney who was representing Gosnell, he got up and he was giving his closing argument to the jury, and probably just trying to read their facial expressions and make tweaks to his presentation as he went along, and he could tell that he wasn't winning them over. And sort of the elephant in the room question, well, I should go back and say the argument that they were trying to make, their defense, was no, they weren't born alive, they were born dead. The law wasn't broken because they came out dead. Which I guess is the best defense you can get. It's a legal defense. Unfortunately, in the abortion regime that we have, that makes a difference. So that was the path they were pursuing, and from a legal strategy standpoint, I think that was probably the right call. But the big elephant in the room question that was hanging over everybody's head was, well, if they came out dead, why did you then cut their spinal cords? Because that was done with scissors ex utero, and the evidence clearly showed that. So the question was, why on earth would you cut the necks of already dead corpses? What on earth would possess you to do that? And he could tell that that question was hanging over the jury's head, and kind of on the fly, in my opinion, maybe he did rehearse it but just said it really badly, said something like, well, it was, just in case, whatever little life might have been left. It's like, what? That's the face I made. I mean, it kind of reminded me of that scene in The Princess Bride where they say, he's only mostly dead, he's a little alive. It works there because it's a comedy. This was not funny. This was trying to reinvent the basic science of what is alive and dead to make it a matter of degree to get away with murder, which thankfully did not work. He is obviously in prison. But yeah, I don't know where I was going with that story, but that's just what stands out to
Mm-hmm.
me from the Gosnell case. And we, just recently, just earlier this week, Governor of Pennsylvania stated that he was going to veto the 20-week ban that just passed the Pennsylvania legislature. So it's clear the state sadly hasn't learned anything from the Gosnell debacle.
What were your reactions and thoughts about the revelations of Planned Parenthood and the child body parts trafficking?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I love the work that Center for Medical Progress has done. I think it's really valuable. I think it's definitely a marathon project. David has been at this for years, and I know he hoped to see justice sooner, but we are starting to see some good signs. We're seeing now, over 2 years, like closer to 2.5 years after the initial release of the videos, we're finally seeing and DOJ investigation, we're finally seeing that one of the partner businesses out in California has admitted guilt and paid a settlement, I think, of $7 or $8 million. So I think the dominoes are finally starting to fall on that, which is great. It's interesting to me, though, just as a matter of psychology or human nature or what have you, that people got more upset about what happened to the bodies than the fact that there were bodies. Like that fetal disposal has become such an issue, even for people who, in some cases, are okay with abortion. And I don't get it. I don't understand it. I'm happy that the pro-life movement is using that to its advantage, but on a basic personal level, I don't get it. I just don't understand why it is that somebody would freak out over the sale of a baby's liver, but not, throwing that baby's liver in the trash after tearing that child limb from limb in an abortion. Somebody please explain it to me.
Yeah, that is difficult to explain. Another thing that's difficult to explain is you'll often hear feminists bemoan the fact in Asia and China there are gender-specific abortions. Like, for instance, in India, they typically target girls. Now, I remember reading an article where, to my shock, they said the problem isn't that they're killing too many girls, they're not killing enough boys.
Oh, well,
And I
speaking of
thought, wait.
crazy rationalizations.
And I'm like, wait, why don't we just kill fewer girls? Maybe that's the solution.
How about we don't kill anybody?
I know.
Whoa.
It's so unbelievable. And so, but it's an interesting context because when you shift it back to the U.S.-Canadian discussion, they act like you're not killing people. But when you go to China and India, they implicitly acknowledge you're killing girls. So while it's abortion in both parts of the world, why is it in one case they focus on the gender of the fetus as if it's some sort of sex crime, but when it's in North America, nothing's going on?
Yeah, and I think that's another good example of the kind of a scenario that can open people's minds, highlighting those contrasts and emphasizing, while every child is unique, they're not different entities in the United States than they are in India or China. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the latest thing that I've been hearing on the sex selection abortion front, there have been a few states here in the U.S. that have passed or attempted to pass bans on sex selective abortion or abortion on the basis of sex, and the pro-abortion feminist response has been to call it racist, because sex selective abortion is associated with particular Asian cultures. So banning it is racist.
Wow.
You can't make this up.
Just wow.
So it's an interesting landscape to see. As I said, it's whack-a-mole. There's a new argument, it seems, every week, which I hope is a sign of a movement on its last legs.
That would be nice. Another question is, one of the key issues in any debate revolving around abortion is, when does life begin? So when you're trying to debate with a pro-choice person, how do you demonstrate that? How would you go about demonstrating that the fetus is a life, that it's not a part of the mother's body, not just a piece of flesh?
Mhm.
And where would you pinpoint the origin of that life? So there's a lot of
So,
questions right there, but
right. No, that's perfectly fine. You can go about it in a few different ways. For people who are kind of visually oriented, just showing photographs and images of, and there's even video footage of embryos and fetuses in the womb can be really helpful. You know, they've been moving away from the whole clump of cells thing, but it's still out there. And a lot of, particularly for people who just haven't really wanted to dive into the debate because, again, it's contentious and scary, may just not know. So one resource I like to recommend for that is called the Endowment for Human Development. It's at ehd.org, and it contains like a huge gallery of images and videos from the very beginnings of pregnancy through almost to birth. So that's a really great resource. But if I don't have that on hand, or the person for whatever reason isn't going to be looking at any pictures, I like to you can set aside the textbook citations, you can set aside the videos. All of that is helpful, but you can also kind of get at it as a matter of first principles and just by sort of through the Socratic method. So you can say, we can work backwards is what I like to do. So I say, you are what, in your 20s or 30s?
yeah.
Prior to that, you would have been an adolescent. Prior to that, you were a child. Prior to that, you were a toddler. Prior to that, you were an infant. Prior to that, you were a newborn. Prior to that, you were a fetus who was, 8 months and 3 weeks and 6 days in the womb. I think we can acknowledge that was still you, right? Okay, so let's go backwards to, just keep going backwards um, through the pregnancy, um, and you can trace that person's life back to fertilization and no further, because prior to fertilization you have an egg over here and a sperm over there, and half of the DNA is in each, and there's other sperm out there that could have been used for fertilization. So at that point, you can't point to that individual human being. So sometimes that sort of just taking it backwards and thinking about it way just of inviting people to explore their own identity is helpful.
Now, from a biological point of view, there seems to be a lot of contemporary research that does demonstrate that the fetus is distinct from the mother, different DNA,
Sure, sure.
different. What are some of the exciting discoveries in that field that have helped the pro-life movement with its arguments?
I mean, I think the core science of life beginning at fertilization has been around for quite some time, but we continue to see interesting scientific developments. There's still a debate raging about when fetal pain develops, as I'm sure your listeners are aware, and also the study of fetal learning has had a lot of interesting research in the last few years, trying to figure out pattern recognition. If a mother reads the same story every day or sings the same song every day, will the newborn infant after birth then react differently to that story or song versus one they've never heard before? That kind of research is really interesting to me, but it does have its limitations because it really only can work on on later pregnancy. Otherwise, you have the variable of, oh well, 5 months have passed since we had those experiments on the child earlier in gestation. Now this becomes a memory test, right? So trying to measure learning and memory at the same time is tricky. But yeah, I think the field is very active and very interesting to us, and I look forward to seeing what else they come up with.
Mm-hmm. What if you were able to achieve a society in which the right to life of the unborn fetus was protected by law, how would it look compared to the society we have now? How would it be different? How would it be similar?
I think it would offer a lot more support to women, and mothers, obviously. I think it would be a real push for better work policies and work-life balance. But I think in a lot of ways it would be, similar to today. I think those changes, are going to be different in every society, right? So, um, what I like to, people often ask me about, changing the culture and that kind of thing, and I think that's really important. Um, what we're asking for, not killing babies, that's a really basic, as we said, basic human rights stance. So I think it can be incorporated into many cultures and many worldviews and many societies. So a pro-life society, there's not just one. There can be many, and there are many, and have been many, and will be many pro-life societies, and they can all look different, but what they have in common, obviously, is
Hmm.
protection of the child.
Maybe a more relevant question was how would it look different from the old pro-life regime we used to have, say in 1950?
Okay, yeah. So obviously a ton has changed between 1950 and now, right? The main difference being, well, several main differences. The prevalence of contraception, uh, the growing acceptance of single motherhood, and less shame, shame, shame on you, and just a more generally feminist environment. I think all of those things will stay with us. There seems to be this fear from some abortion supporters that it does mean going back to 1950, or it means going to Gilead and the Handmaid's Tale, and that's not what we're after here. We're not talking about women no longer being part of the workforce. I think it's actually kind of insulting, as a woman, this notion that women can't succeed in the workforce unless we're able to kill our children. Like, you realize moms work, right? I don't understand that. But we're not going back to 1950. I have no desire to go back to 1950, and it's impossible to go back to 1950. What we're looking for is a society where unborn children are protected and mothers get the support that they need, particularly from the men. Let's not let the
Yeah.
deadbeat dads off the hook on this one, but also from society at large.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned earlier that a lot of the more sophisticated pro-choice advocates will talk about the importance of bodily autonomy.
Hmm.
What if it were to turn out at some point in the future that a society that values bodily autonomy to the degree that it has thus far is not the kind of society that is able to marshal the moral or legal support to pass pro-life legislation? How would that affect the secular pro-life movement?
You're asking, like, basically, if they win the intellectual fight. I mean, it's been going on for 50 plus years. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. But if you don't mind me diverting your question a little
Sure.
bit, I think the bodily autonomy justification for abortion is facing a lot of hurdles. Um, one of which is the development of artificial womb technology. I think it's very possible that is what brings an end to Roe v. Wade. Um, and I wouldn't say it's startling to me, because not much surprises me anymore, but it was startling to a lot of people who, took the abortion industry at face value when they say that it's about bodily autonomy. It was startling to them to see pro-choice op-eds against artificial wombs. Like, oh my gosh, this is incredibly dangerous for women because it's going to be the end of abortion access. And people are going, wait a minute. I thought the point of abortion was just to disconnect the mother from the child. I thought that's what this was really about, and the death of the child was just a sad side effect. That's what you've been telling us for all these years. Now you're saying it's once it becomes possible to disconnect the child without death, that's a bad thing. I think that has opened some eyes to the disingenuousness of that bodily autonomy position. And in a similar vein, so does the pro-choice movement's reaction to abortion survivors. Through my years of pro-life advocacy, I have been very lucky and thankful to get to know some abortion survivors who have become friends. And the phrase failed abortion to describe a born alive abortion is interesting to me. Like, really? What failed? The baby's not in the mother's body anymore. I thought that was the goal. Oh, you mean because she didn't die, right? Like, the goal is a dead baby. I mean, that's just become so abundantly clear that it's hard for me to take the bodily autonomy argument seriously. But again, that's the kind of scenario where, if someone is talking to you about, oh, I believe in bodily autonomy and that's why I support abortion, those are the kinds of counterexamples you can bring up. Like, okay, if we could have basically violence-free abortions, would you be on board with that? And if not, why not? What's really going on here?
Well, it's interesting because when you bring up bodily autonomy, we have with Peter Singer, he does admit that the fetus is a human being in his arguments. And he argues that the bodily autonomy of the woman overrides that of the child, but says, too, what about the child's bodily autonomy?
Well, and his argument isn't fully based in bodily autonomy either, because then he goes on to condone infanticide, which has no bodily autonomy justification at all. So, it's all over the place.
Now, it's interesting, her name escapes me, but another great victory for the pro-life movement is the woman in the Roe v. Wade case later became a pro-life activist.
Norma McCorvey, yes, that's the name.
So maybe you could explain how she sort of turned her to the pro-life side.
Oh, I don't feel fully qualified to do this, but I can give sort of the general sketch. She, at the time of Roe v. Wade, first of all, she never actually had an abortion. She wound up, the pregnancy that started Roe v. Wade ended with her placing that child for adoption, because obviously it takes a lot more than 9 months for a case to reach the Supreme Court of the United States. So she never had an abortion, but she did end up working, I believe, at least one abortion facility, possibly more, after Roe. But as she matured, I mean, she was fairly young at the time of Roe v. Wade. As she matured, she began to see that, that the lawyers who brought Roe v. Wade had been somewhat manipulative toward her, and I don't recall all of the details of this, I'm sorry, but there were just a lot of things that kind of drove her away from abortion advocacy. And then ultimately she did, not only did she become pro-life, but became very vocally so, and became an active part of the movement until her death, which was just within the past couple of years.
Now, we've, at least I've heard that the younger generation of now is more pro-life than it's ever been before. What do you think are some of the factors for that? And what do you see the growth of the pro-life movement in the future?
So I think what we call the pro-life generation, the millennial generation, we are more pro-life than our parents' generation. We're about on par with the grandparents' generation. So I think it comes down to a lot of factors. One of which I've already mentioned, the internet. It's a lot easier for pro-lifers to break through with information that maybe some of the larger mainstream sources don't want people to hear. It's a lot easier for us to break through with that in this day and age and harness the internet to our advantage. So I think that's a factor. I think the fact that people my age grew up with ultrasound just being a normal part of life. We, saw the ultrasounds of our younger siblings. Maybe we've even seen our own ultrasound photos in baby albums and stuff. It's a lot harder to escape the humanity of the unborn child. as you said before, it's the out of sight, out of mind thing. I think it was easier for older generations to maintain the out of sight, out of mind than it is for young adults today. So I think there's a whole confluence of factors and good organizing. I mean, the proliferation of student groups in high schools and in college campuses, groups like Students for Life of America, and related organizations that have invested a lot of time and effort and money in developing pro-life student leadership. So it's a combination of factors, some in our control and some not, but I will happily embrace the trend.
Oh yeah, that's something to be definitely looking forward to. What do you think the future development of the pro-life movement? You think it'll grow and become more influential amongst the broader demographic cross section?
Well, I think we are at we're in sort of a transitional period in the pro-life movement where things are becoming increasingly youth-led, but at the same time there are a lot of I'm sure everyone will be shocked to hear that there are a lot of political divisions in the country, and the pro-life movement has a lot to deal with, a lot of questions about how much or to what extent are we willing to hold our nose for pro-life candidates is a hugely debated question, a very hot topic. How do we maintain our growth and open the pro-life movement to demographics who weren't previously involved without creating, these internal battles and getting into fights about unrelated issues. I don't have, the magic bullet answer to that, but I'm comforted that every social movement has gone through this. I mean, there is no such thing as a social movement that has had perfect unity. So I think that we can get through that divisiveness, realize that it's a natural byproduct of being a movement that encompasses something like half the adult population of the United States, and that, okay, we're going to have that problem. It's inevitable, but let's be grateful for it because it's a side effect of how many of us there are.
It,
So my hope is that we can get over that bump in the road that is being caused by our current political moment, and we definitely need to see more pro-life Democrats for sure, and it'll be really interesting to me to see what happens when the pro-life generation gets old enough to run for office.
yeah, that will be very interesting. What do you think? This has caused a lot of controversy during the last year. What do you think about Donald Trump's position on abortion and Planned Parenthood, which caused a lot of stir in 2016?
So I'm not a huge fan of Donald Trump, and that's not going to, that's not a secret. As far as his position on abortion and Planned Parenthood, I think that's great. I'm glad that he's putting pro-life policies into place. I'm glad that he's nominating pro-life justices. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the controversy over his position on Planned Parenthood. I mean, are you talking about Planned Parenthood defunding
Well,
or?
just the whole media kerfuffle whenever he would go to the debates with either Clinton or the Republican primaries.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously there's a lot of bluster to Donald Trump, and as I talked before about that the best way to convince people is not to be sarcastic, but to ask questions and lead people through their own thinking about abortion, and obviously that's not what Donald Trump's doing. He's loud in a way that doesn't fit my personal style at all, but obviously a lot of people do like Donald Trump's personal style. We actually, so Students for Life of America, a group I've mentioned before, in the weeks and months leading up to the November 2016 election, they were really disturbed to see, student activists breaking friendships and severing ties with each other over, Trump or never Trump or whatever, and all of those debates, which, while important, are not the abortion debate. Breaking ties with fellow pro-lifers, which is just not helpful. So they put together this this webcast. They did a live Facebook event, and it was called Election Wine, WHINE, but we drank WINE to get through this cluster of an election together. And it was me representing the never Trump position and my friend Lauren representing the pro-Trump position, and the two of us basically just sat there and drank our wine and talked it out, and we were still friends at the end of it. So it was a way of you know, not so much a way of me convincing her or her convincing me, but a way of airing out our differences and being an example, being a model to pro-life students about how to disagree well, and how to still maintain those relationships. You're going to, if you get involved in political debates, and of course the abortion issue attracts people who are interested in political debates, so that ups the ante even more. But if you're going to get offended over every little thing and declare, I'm never speaking to you again, well, you're going to wind up lonely in a corner pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to double back quickly on your comment about the diversity amongst the pro-life movement and how it can lead to divisions. It reminds me of the axiom of war, that it's not the person who's the best that wins, but the one that makes the least mistakes. And it looks like that the pro-choice movement has been making a lot of silly mistakes.
Well, they have and we have, so
that's true too.
Time will tell, I suppose. But that's a good point.
Well, we're nearing the end of the time allotted for the interview. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with?
Just that I really thank you for having me, and I encourage your listeners, if you're interested in learning more about Secular Pro-Life, you can go to our website, which is secularprolife.org, and we're also on Facebook and Twitter.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your work to try to save the lives of unborn children.
Thank you.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.